Well, this is the last thing we're doing today before we all go to the movies. Looking forward, developing and implementing effective counterterrorism strategy. We saved this for last, so you'll all know what to do after you leave. We will be moderated by Dr. Lila Kohistany. She'll be joined by Colonel Jason Johnson, United States Army Special Operations, Dr. Julie Cherno-Huang, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science and International Relations at the Gosher College and Senior Research Fellow at the Soufan Center, Dr. Ben Conable, Independent Research Leader and Consultant, Adjunct Security Studies Professor, University of Georgetown, and my good friend, Robert Kassane, Special Agent in charge of the New York Joint Terrorism Task Force, who, at this very moment, 1 week ago tonight, was wrapping up a case with the RCMP of a man who was getting on an airplane to head to New York to conduct an attack involving gunfire at a Jewish center in New York City and Brooklyn. So this isn't abstract. This is all real, what they're talking about. Let's welcome our panel.
Going to be planning any kind of operations any kind of time soon, so that's a good thing. Good afternoon, everyone. DM me on LinkedIn, and I'll send you an Amazon gift card for staying. Please. Okay, thank you so much for being here. I know it's the end of the day. On behalf of all of the panelists, I'll thank Ali Soufan and the Soufan Center so that we can just dive in and get started. This panel, an esteemed group of people who have a ton of lived experience, and so they're going to be drawing on that as we talk about the future and developing effective counterterrorism strategy. So I'd like to start off with Rob. You've served in the FBI for over 2 decades, most of it in New York. You went to DC because you had to, and then came back to New York. So let's start with you from your vantage point at the FBI's New York field office, where you also oversee the Joint Terrorism Task Force. What are the most significant challenges that you're seeing that the U.S. is facing, both in detecting and preventing terrorism internationally? And what are you all doing to address those challenges?
Lila, great question. Thank you very much. I just have 10 points I'm going to go over in the next 20 minutes.
Yeah, so to Jason,
Sorry,
Ben, and
awful
Julie, no
joke.
time for you.
Sorry. No, great question. So there's a lot. I'll talk about a few things, and I'll sort of dive into one of them. And one of the things that's been discussed a lot is emerging technology, but we're very much concerned about encrypted apps, disappearing messages, AI, and other technology that helps terrorist organizations, individual people, and criminals of any nature, hide what they're doing in terms of activities and their communications to do nefarious things. But I'm not going to get into that because there's a lot of discussion on that. Another thing that's been talked a lot about is Iran. And sort of the aspect that I'll talk a little bit about is their rapidly evolving relationship with China, which I feel is a very significant issue and challenge for us in terms of detecting and preventing terrorism. And reason, in 2021, Iran and China entered into a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement. And ever since then, Iran has been incredibly brazen and aggressive. Iran and their proxies, incredibly brazen and aggressive, and I would say much more so than any time in recent memory. And when you look at the technology and the resources that China can transfer to Iran, their proxies, it could significantly change their capabilities. And when you look at October 7th, the surprise there, the impact there, and the, not in a very good way, but the evolving situation in the Middle East, I think it's interesting to look at that relationship with China. And again, that technology and those resources will absolutely make it more difficult for us to detect and prevent terrorism, I think. The thing I'll talk a little bit more about is the chaos at the border, not just the southern border, but really all the borders. When you look at the massive increase in the number of encounters, particularly at the southern border, but in general, the asylum policies and the lack of information that a lot of these individuals that are crossing the border seeking asylum provide, or the incorrect information that they provide, it makes it incredibly challenging for U.S. Customs and Border Protection to do their job. And it's not a knock on them. They do, I believe, an incredible job given a very challenging situation. But certainly that puts a lot of stressors on our ability as a government to vet the individuals that are coming in. A couple examples of how that's impacting us and increasing risk for the United States. One is much talked about in the last few days and in the last several months, but the ISIS-Khorasan threat stream. ISIS-Khorasan, as most people know, has been the most aggressive terrorist group in the last year. High-profile, complex, successful attacks in Iran and Russia, calls for attacks in Western Europe and the United States. We now have several hundred investigations across the FBI on mostly Uzbeks and Tajiks that have varying levels of connectivity to ISIS-Khorasan. So it's a significant issue for us. These are individuals that came across the border, claimed asylum. 2 or 3 months later, we get information, we get an intel report about their connectivity to ISIS-K. Some of them have very significant connectivity to individuals that were involved in attack plotting overseas. Some of them have less connectivity. We were able to disrupt 8 of those individuals, but that took a lot to disrupt those individuals. And we weren't able to get terrorism charges on them because of their use of encrypted apps and other things.
Coming full circle.
Yep, exactly. And there's others. It's not just ISIS-K. A relative of the ISIS Somalia emir came to the border with 4 individuals. This individual was also a facilitator for ISIS. They were stopped. That's great. But the 4 individuals this person was with came into the country, got through, and are spread throughout the United States, and they're active investigations. So massive, significantly more risk that we're sitting on and that we're dealing with, that we're trying to investigate because of the situation at the border. In terms of what we're doing, from New York and the other offices that are working these investigations, we're doing what we can to help our headquarters brief the National Security Council, the appropriate congressional committees, to make sure that they're tracking the risk as we see it, so that they can impact policy and legislation, hopefully. I do think it's gotten somewhat better, but we're still in a pretty tough spot. The other thing we're doing is, in the New York JTTF, we've got a phenomenal team, Customs Border Patrol, NSA, many other partners. We're doing what we can to ensure that we share information aggressively so that Customs and Border Patrol can do what they can at the border to get information and as effectively flag individuals that have connectivity to people we care about. And obviously NSA and others are doing the same.
Okay, thank you for that, Rob. So everything that you've talked about, even though you're based here in New York, is global as well in nature. And so I'd like to shift over to Colonel Jason Johnston. He is attending in his personal capacity. I have to read this disclaimer. So he is an active duty Special Forces colonel, but his views do not represent the Department of Defense, the U.S. Army, or U.S. Army Special Operations Command. So Jason, you've completed over 22 combat and operational deployments. You've deployed a lot all over the world. You've worked with partners all over the world across multiple continents. So as we sort of zoom a bit out and building off of what Rob talked about, tell us a bit about how you see CT and the military's role in that evolving landscape, and especially because you are a Special Forces officer and you've deployed in leading multinational joint and interagency organizations. I really want you to focus on how we effectively counter terrorism, but in a strategic competition environment.
Yeah, okay, so I think what's important and it's key and it's under threat is I hope that going forward, what we don't do is lose the lessons that we gained and gleaned over the last 21 years, 23 years. Those were incredibly important. I think to directly answer your question, how does it look going forward? I think our operations will get smaller, almost by necessity. They've gotten smaller by necessity. They'll be also partially by necessity more remote and remotely conducted. We're doing that. We can do remarkable things from a little base in Georgia, in Ukraine. Not Georgia, not that Georgia, our Georgia in Ukraine. And they need to be, this is the hopeful part, that they become more partnered. They absolutely have to be more partnered, which I know we'll talk about going forward. But you talked about the competition aspect of all this. You know, when I came in the Army in 89, 90, first thing I did was I was an intelligence private. I was a private, 17 years old. Go to Defense Language Institute to learn Russian. And our company T-shirt said, you know, we're learning Russian so you don't have to. You know, we studied Russian order of battle, and for those of you who don't know what order of battle is, it's kind of the way you visualize the foreign or the enemy forces coming across the line in time and space, what they look like, what elements they lead with. We studied Russian and Soviet order of battle. Fast forward to 96 probably, 96 to 2002 timeframe. They would add in these little icons. One would say car bomb. One would say assassination. These are what we use for our war games. One would say public unrest. And we're thinking, we're going through these academic, these military academic institutions and doing our war games, and we've got the Soviet motorized rifle division is coming across the line, and I've got this leftover icon, almost like a leftover IKEA piece that I didn't get to put in the furniture when I built it, of car bomb. What do you even do with that? Things went the world was kind of crazy. We didn't know exactly how to define it. And then 9/11 happened, and everything changed. There was no more order of battle. The reason I bring all that up is because now we're back to, in some sense, at least on the military side, and that's the only thing I'm qualified to talk about here, we're back to a Cold War, but one in which we are training for, it's called LSCO, large-scale combat operations. We are told by DoD we need to train for that, but what's the evidence? The evidence otherwise is that all of our people are still in deserts. All of our people are still doing CT, with the exception of Ukraine, which we've gotten very involved in as well. So it's a confusing thing on the ground. It's generational. If you think if you came in the Army 3 years after 9/11, you could have retired on Tuesday. So as we're training for both, but we're told to train for LSCO, but the trainers don't even remember how to train for LSCO. They weren't in. Yeah. So it's a confusing situation on the ground. To close that out again, and a further complication is that in the places where we're doing CT, our adversaries are also there, oftentimes at the behest and invite of the government, the very government that invited us there. Mali is an example. There are others. There are many in Africa. And also China is there. So that's a confusing thing for our people. So what is it going to look like going forward? It's going to be confusing, but it's also going to be small, remote, and hopefully very heavily partnered.
Thank you for that, Jason. Building off of what he just talked about, I'd like to turn to Ben Conable, Dr. Conable. You're a retired Marine Corps intelligence officer. You're a Middle East foreign area officer. You are a political scientist. You've studied and written extensively about conflict and insurgencies. I'd like your thoughts on strategic competition and how this sort of low-level thing that Jason's just talking about, this potential large-scale combat operations could happen, but it's sort of at this simmering between all of these major powers. How do you see it, especially from a policy and academic perspective, intersecting with these challenges of CT? And how do these dynamics influence one another?
Jason just teed me up perfectly, and Chris Costa brought this up before as well. To a significant extent, everybody in this room that practices CT on a daily basis is victim of your own success. And Chris and I and others were here from the outset when this gigantic machine that everybody's been talking about was built from the ground up to find, fix, finish, exploit, all the things that we do to counter terrorism. We had a panel, 2 panels ago, that talked about the other part of it, the soft part of it. But we all know, and I think that the members of that panel spoke about it as well, that it's very much a meat eater's game, and that the leaf eaters were generally not invited to the table. So that you were tremendously successful, but we knew eventually that the number of targets was going to drop. And the other thing you're a victim of is the myopia of the U.S. government, and that we tend to be able to only focus on one thing at a time. And I would argue that the most damaging nexus between those two things is that we are talking really here about tactics on both ends. So when we talk about counterterrorism, we're talking about a tactic, and we're talking about great power competition. I don't even know what that is, frankly. It's kind of forehead-slappingly obvious that we're competing with our adversaries. We've been doing that since we've had adversaries. But that's the elephant in the room, is that we built this machine to execute a tactic. And in the absence of a strategy that ties all of these things together, that explains to us why we have a country policy, why we have a regional policy, why we have a national or an international objective, inevitably we were going to lose focus. Inevitably we were going to start shifting all over the place. And it didn't just start happening like Chris talked about in 2017. It started happening in 2004, 5, 6. We were already trying to get out of Iraq desperately. And the shift to Asia, the pivot to Asia, the shift to combat operations happened well before the 2018 National Defense Strategy. But none of the strategic dialogue, none of the strategies that we have to work from address this fundamental problem that counterterrorism is a tactic. We don't really know what great power competition is. I would argue, and I think this is what Chris was getting at, the way Chris put it was they need to coexist. I would argue that counterterrorism cannot exist without fitting within this broader strategic paradigm of great power competition. And that if we're going to carry counterterrorism forward, we're not going to just kind of dwindle down into nothing as we spend more and more money on China, that we're going to have to, this is going to have to be a policy solution. This has to come from the top down. So again, nothing that anybody in this room is doing wrong or any gap that we can identify. We have a very serious policy problem that is teeing us up for what I think everybody here has described as an impending failure.
So Ben, if you could write that policy, what would it look like?
It's a grand strategy, so it has to, and that's, we talk about grand strategy in the United States when we say, well, democracies can't have grand strategy because we have elections every 4 years. But we absolutely need to find a way to articulate the why. So the adversaries that we're talking about here are pretty adept at articulating the why. We cannot articulate a why as to why we want to have stability, why we want these countries to be why we want them to partner with us, why we don't want them to be adversaries, why we don't want to create these recruiting pools. We have tactical answers for it. We have brilliant research, the kind of stuff that Julie does. I would second the comment made a couple of panels ago that I don't think it gets read. So all the information is there, and it doesn't get integrated up into strategic discourse. And I would argue that the 2018 National Defense Strategy was a dramatic failure because it led to the Department of Defense significantly decreasing its investment in counterterrorism, both on the kinetic and non-kinetic side. And we all know that without DoD money, at least overseas, not much happens.
Jason and Rob, to an extent as well, I mean, both of you are people who have to execute these policies. Is there anything that you want to add on to what Ben has said?
So I won't get into the answer for the next question so much, but Ben hit on a good point. I mean, as DoD and the U.S. government has shifted significant resources away from the CT fight, it's something that we try to sort of make up for as much as possible through our relationships overseas, but it is a significant challenge.
Yeah.
I'd just say that we can't wish it away just because the military-industrial complex wants us to train for LSCO and wants to resources for LSCO, and the DoD wants us to. Doesn't mean that we can just wish away counterterror, especially when our people are still very much doing it overseas.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Ben, and to Jason and to Rob. Julie, I think this builds off of what Ben is talking about, because when I think about the human elements, what happens to the humans that are actually impacted by all of this, I often feel like we do not have a strategy for how to deal with the actual people that are the most impacted by this. So your expertise lies in terrorist behavior, everything from motivations to join extremist groups, which culminated in your book, Becoming Jihadis, all the way through the life cycle of disengagement and reintegration, which culminated in your book, Why Terrorists Quit. So I've been looking a great deal as an Afghan woman at what happens to women and children who are impacted by these conflicts. The US, UNICEF, even the Syrian Democratic Forces, they are pushing so many countries to repatriate women and children that are coming out of, especially northeastern Syrian camps. What do countries need to do to rehabilitate, to reintegrate, to separate people who might be sympathizers of terrorism from civilians that are all sort of getting mixed together? And what investments do we need to make as an international community?
Thank you so much, Lila. And thank you, Ben, for that shout out. Wow. Okay, so this is a huge issue, and it is a worldwide issue. In northeast Syria, some 45,000 people remain in detention camps, and an estimated 9,000 of them are foreigners. At Al-Hol, Syria's largest camp, 93% are women, and one thing we know about Al-Hol is that the conditions are dire. It's rampant disease, hypothermia, ISIS coming in, radicalizing children, and this highlights why we have to get this right. Delays only increase the risk of further traumatization of women and children, and the children are getting older and having more traumatizing experiences, but also falling deeper into radicalization rabbit holes. Now, the process of repatriation is further complicated by the fact that many of those who came either to fight or to live, not all came to fight, they either had their documents confiscated upon arrival or they burned them. So the first order of business is to have each country be able to verify their nationals. And UNICEF has been instrumental in this regard in helping many countries who haven't been able to do this on their own. The second step is that countries need to conduct a series of assessments, and they need robust assessments. These are medical assessments, which is fairly easy, but also psychological assessments, assessments to what extent a person is a threat, assessments of radicalization, and there needs to be some standardization of what a robust assessment tool looks like, not necessarily a standardization of the tool, but there has to be basic agreement on what a robust assessment tool looks like. Some countries like Malaysia are choosing to first repatriate individuals home and then run the assessments, and those that are seen as having committed an act of terrorism or being dangerous or among the men are being sent to prison, and those who are not are sent to rehabilitation programs. Indonesia is essentially adopting our Remain in Mexico policy, except theirs is Remain in Syria. So they're conducting their assessments at what they call at border, which may actually not be at the border, but they're choosing to do that in Syria. The third phase is the most critical one, the one that I'm going to spend most of the time of my remarks on, and that is rehabilitation and reintegration, and countries have to get this right. This is so critical. Now, this is going to involve a stay at a rehabilitation center where women and children can receive individualized care plans. For women, this is going to include culturally appropriate trauma counseling. People will come with traumas, and there will be different traumas. And that's why you have individualized plans. These will not only be traumas from the experience with ISIS, but traumas from the camps. Also, there may be traumas from coming home and the process of leaving. There also may be deep, deep shame about having left in the first place, and alienation from families. And so they will need that. They will also need vocational training. Children are going to need trauma counseling, but in different ways, via play therapy. They'll also need education because there has been little to no education at Al Hol or Roche. They'll need educators, they'll need social workers and psychologists. There's going to need to be playgrounds and football fields. And there will need to be enough psychologists trained in trauma-informed methods. And when you have a country like Morocco that's graduating about 7 per year, psychologists total, it's not enough.
Yeah.
It's
daunting.
It's incredibly daunting. It's also been shown that de-radicalization is best embarked upon not when somebody first returns, but later after trust has been established between social worker, psychologist, and returnee. Otherwise, people are going to shut down. According to Mallet and Hayes, the risk of returning foreign terrorist fighters carrying out attacks on their homeland is greatest in the first 5 months. So it's important that these programs not be in and out. There need to be at least be 5 to 6 months with willingness to keep people that are really struggling for upwards to a year. And then you have to work on how do they return to society. And that requires destigmatization programs to get society ready for them so that the people returning home can actually get hired and that the children don't get bullied when they go to school, because if that happens, it's going to drive them right into the arms of the ISIS sympathizers in their home country. They're going to need to be able to earn a living and all of those things. Now, international organizations have a real role to play here. As said earlier, UNICEF has helped countries identify their nationals, has helped with the assessments, but countries with strong rehabilitation programs and reintegration programs need to share best practices. There needs to be some kind of venue, some kind of conferences where countries that have started doing it earlier and who are doing it well can share their best practices, at least high-level best practices, with the countries that are just starting out, so they can pull from those what might work in their contexts.
And Julie, I feel like during one of the previous panels, someone mentioned that our European partners have much better programs, that 25 years worth of information, and that we could be learning from them.
On disengagement, reintegration, but not necessarily repatriation. So this needs to be something taken very seriously, and there's a great opportunity for the international community. And I also just want to give a shout out to the USIP's RISE Action Guide, which is going to be really useful for destigmatization.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Rob, back to you. We've heard a lot about networks, a lot about collaboration, a lot about partnership. And you've had experience investigating terrorist threats originating in the Arabian Peninsula, in Africa, in China, and that's obviously going to require and has required a lot of people coming together and working together across national, culture, language, all of these types of different boundaries. So in an area where, or in an era where terrorism is planned in one place and executed in a completely different place across all of these borders with a ton of ease. Tell us a little bit about what the Bureau is doing when it comes to coordinating with our international partners and what you see as the need in the future.
Yep, outstanding. So, you know, the Bureau writ large has multiple efforts going on. We have over 120 offices throughout the world that have, you know, we have FBI folks on the ground partnering with people. We have various programs like the National Academy, International Executive Partnership, that identify law enforcement folks overseas that we've worked well with together to bring them over for training and to sort of build that relationship. We have various online platforms, and you know, we partner with DoD on the XOps platform over in Jordan, you know, working with folks. But I'll talk a little bit more specifically about what I would say the New York JTTF in particular has really done a great job on over at least the last 30 years. I'm looking at Reed Rowe out there and Ollie out there, and there were young agents on the JTTF back in those times, doing great work. And the first couple of rows, we got a bunch of current New York JTTF folks And it's really as simple as just getting aggressive, passionate, competent people that are great team players, pushing them out forward. In New York, we cover, like I said, Africa and Western Europe, in addition to Canada and the UK. Putting people out there, connecting with our partners in all those places, working joint investigations, working joint sources. That gets us access to more information. It builds our partners' capacity over there, and it helps us identify and take some kind of an action against senior leaders, folks that are over there planning operations there that might impact Americans, but also planning operations from over there that might impact the homeland. And like Ben said, we want as much DoD over there as possible. Even at the best of times, we partner with your folks, but when that goes down, and it's still a challenge, but when that DoD footprint goes down, when guys like Jason are focused on other things, which we understand they need to be focused on, it's much more challenging. And when we can partner with DoD, we can layer authorities, layer capabilities, and come up with the best way for the U.S. government to have an impact on mitigating those threats before they start. In terms of going forward, some of the things that we have been a part of, our team here worked with headquarters and our international operations team on setting up a New York JTTF. Sorry, not a New York JTTF, a Kenyan JTTF over in Nairobi. And a lot of the folks that are here are intimately involved in those efforts. And that's really taking the same, great people, team players. Here in the United States, we have 50 different entities on the New York JTTF. We aggressively share information to identify, investigate, and mitigate threats. And sometimes our partners overseas aren't as collaborative or trusting with different parts of their government. And I think by having our folks, having NYPD detectives, FBI agents, assistant U.S. attorneys from Southern District and Eastern District go over there and work with our partners on investigations that matter to them and matter to us, it shows the value of collaboration, of teamwork, and how by trusting your partners and by sharing information, you can have an impact. And so I think going forward, we're looking to, take that model of the New York JTTF and how that led to the Kenyan JTTF and build that out in other countries, particularly countries where Kenya's close to Somalia, obviously a significant issue. All of East Africa has always been a significant issue. And so it's strategically placed and looking at other places where we can do more of that.
Thank you, Rob. Jason, building off of his points, what do you see as the most compelling challenges when it comes to building these partnerships, and what is the special operations community doing right now to prepare for the future?
Yep. So now the most difficult challenges are, frankly, lessening of funding and lessening of fewer operations going on. We send kind of the treatment for that is to send small special operations teams over to these places because it's less offensive, it's less invasive. Why send 12,000 when you can send 12, of course? That's how you build partnerships. So it's a challenge to have partners if you can't go see them. And it's a little easier on the law enforcement side and in places where we can build those partnerships and kind of, they just do it better. We do it after the crisis has already started. So we got really, really good at building partnerships over in Afghanistan, for instance. The only benefit of a long war is these great partnerships that you've built in year 18 of it, is that if you went to the Chow Hall, to the dining facility in Kabul in 2010, 12, all the way through 2019, you'd see a Bosnian sitting at the table with a Croat, sitting at the table with a British customs agent, sitting at the table with an FBI agent, sitting at the table with a US soldier, and maybe a Mongolian or two. All at the same table, right? That translated into all sorts of things for us. There really are very few places where we, the military, do that well and do that well now, and do that well on the left side of an emergency or left of bang. And one of those is what Rob mentioned in the XOps platform, forward in Jordan, but also their sort of rear headquarters, the Joint Interagency Task Force National Capital Region in Crystal City. That's where you can have, and this is an imaginary scenario, but one that happens, ones like this happen constantly, where a Bulgarian policeman can get information from his home country, pass it over to the British SAS NCO sitting at the next desk over, who then passes that on to the FBI agent or rep that's in the room, and then an arrest is made in Arizona. Right? That's not uncommon, even though that was a made-up scenario. But it's not uncommon. My biggest, Secretary Mayorkas said the first day, and I latched onto it right away. He said dissemination of info to the broadest audience. Everyone, I think most of the people in here, certainly most of the people on the law enforcement side, understand that very well. For us, we have this sort of banner that we put in our joint operations centers everywhere that says, who else needs to know? Right? You get that piece of information, you're sitting at your desk or wherever you are. Information intelligence isn't meant to be hoarded, it's meant to be disseminated, or else it's useless. You may look good for having it, but it does no one else any good. That's what partnerships do. Without partners, there's no one else to give that information or intelligence to. Biggest point there. We've got to have it left of emergency and not cobble it together afterwards. That's how we're going to do things in the resource-constrained environment that you mentioned.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason. Ben, being mindful of time, what do you believe are the most strategic challenges that the United States is going to face over the next 20 years? And what can both policymakers and practitioners do to get ahead of those, like what Jason's saying, try to get ahead of bang?
Yeah, we rehearsed that ahead of time, and it still seems kind of daunting. But follically challenged minds think alike, so I agree with everything you just said. But so I will say three things by wrapping up, and I see the clock. So first of all, I think I only heard 3 speakers really mention Iraq over the last 2 days, which was kind of surprising to me, given that Iraq played such a prominent role in many of our lives over the last 2 decades, and we're now seeing the advisors getting pushed out. China, Iran, Russia, all playing an active role there, and every terrorist group on the planet, either adjacent or within the borders of Iraq. So I think we need to get over the Iraq aversion that we have if we're going to look forward, and let's think about what Iraq might look like in 20 years. I apologize, but I'm going to take a quick jab at the special ops community in that we have spent way too much time focusing on training other special operators because they're easier to train than regular troops, and follically challenged minds think alike, right? So it's easy to create that relationship, but I would argue that is taking us down a dangerous pathway, and that we're creating Praetorian forces that are generally going to be incapable of securing entire countries. So somebody briefly mentioned the CTC or CTS in Iraq. CTS couldn't protect Iraq against the Islamic State, even though they fought hard. Looking forward to answer you. I'm not avoiding the question. I think we're going to find out that over the horizon, counterterrorism does not work, with all due respect to our White House representative here, in that the things that we do collectively, whether it's understanding why people conduct terrorist attacks, why they're vulnerable, how to find them and kill them and capture them and imprison them and punish them and all of those things, at the center of it is a human being. And if we are not physically close to the human being and talking to the human being and listening to the human being in proximity, no amount of technology on the planet is going to be able to help us solve that problem. So 20 years from now, if we are not physically co-located with the problems we are trying to solve, I think we're going to find ourselves in very serious trouble.
Thank you, Ben. Julie, last question for you. And we've had a lot of information shared already about the need for a broader strategy that has to exist. You shared a great deal of information about all of the various types of efforts that would need to come to fruition in order to actually help with disengagement and reintegration. In these last couple of minutes, share with us how you would see those fitting into counterterrorism policy.
Thank you, and I'll talk fast. Okay, This is something that is near and dear to my heart. In developing effective counterterrorism strategies, it is imperative to design effective disengagement and reintegration programs, not only as a complement to the kinetic and intelligence gathering measures, but as a goal within itself. The linchpin of successful disengagement and reintegration is the establishment of an alternative social network of supportive family members, friends, and mentors who can help a person envision a post-group life, a post-group identity, and who can facilitate a shift in priorities away from the group toward family, towards education, towards employment, as a counterbalance, as a counterweight to the pull of in-group loyalties. And over the past year, I've been looking at disengagement programs across countries, and have found 6 best practices, and I'm just going to very briefly, in the next 40 seconds, go through them. So the best programs are taking a comprehensive and holistic approach, combining disengagement and reintegration and rehabilitation with support services, mentoring, opportunity to further one's education, obtain gainful employment, and counseling. They are organized and run by multi-sectoral teams comprised of clinicians and practitioners and formers, psychologists and academics at design, implementation, and evaluation. These programs build a sense of community and offer a support network. People who join an extremist group join a community. To successfully leave, they need a supportive community. Fourth, as I said earlier, it needs to be individualized because people are going to have different issues and different traumas and different experiences. Fifth, focus on de-radicalization only after the clinicians and practitioners and psychologists establish a rapport with the participants, because people don't join an extremist group because they hold an extremist ideology. They join because they like the people in it. They click with the people in it, and the ideology functions as a binding agent. So you tackle the underlying reasons that brought them in, and that is going to vary from context to context. And then you get to ideology, and finally monitoring, aftercare.
Julie, I feel like we could spend an entire session just on the topics that you're an expert on. So thank you for trying to do all of that so quickly. What I take away from this is complex. It's going to require a multifaceted approach. We need military, we need law enforcement, we need intelligence, and we need community to be involved. So thank you all for representing these vastly different viewpoints. I appreciate that we converged and also diverged on a few things. So thank you again to our esteemed panelists. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.